Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We have a lot of exciting material to get through, so I'm going to jump right into it. As Peyton said, I would love to entertain questions as we go. So the best place to start is with a question. What is hyper-engagement? Kind of a new term on the digital learning landscape. In one line, it's a framework for skilling today's modern learners at scale. I just want to unpack that a little bit. From a skilling perspective, as we all know, the shelf life of skills today is rapidly decreasing. We live in a skills economy. So the concept of rapid reskilling is becoming more and more important for survival. There are different features that we're going to discuss today, elements of experiential learning, hands-on assessment, and spaced repetition that really help from a skilling perspective. Next, we focus on the modern learner. These are distracted media consumers. They are looking for micro-learning that's personalized. So personalization is a very important part of hyper-engagement for modern learners. But also they're looking for something potentially gamified, more cinematic, and certainly mobile and social. We won't use the term millennial in this presentation. We'll call them modern learners instead. Because millennial is a state of mind, not an age. And then finally, scale. Obviously, in order to reach large numbers of modern learners quickly and effectively, you need to be able to do it at scale. And that means these programs need to be automated. They need to have kind of a cloud element to them. They're online, but also elements of machine learning and dynamic curation. Getting people to participate with your program is often overlooked in learning, and I think marketing is just as important, if not more important, because we're trying to get people to do something they don't have time for and aren't always, inclined to want to do. Nudging is a good way to stay collaborative, and of course, crowdsourcing as much as you can. So these are some of the concepts that we're going to be tackling today, but I think throughout, I want you to think about skilling modern learners at scale. So in a presentation I made a few weeks ago in a book I'm working on now for hyper-engagement, we've identified 10 primary elements. This is a recipe of sorts for skilling modern learners at scale. We're not going to cover all 10 of these. That would be too much, but focus more on the core 5. And those core 5 are personalization, gamification, hands-on practice, experiential assessment, and recharging. So I thought, it would be kind of fun to revisit a 1990s science fiction movie I enjoyed so much called The Fifth Element. One of the taglines I liked from this movie, if you see on that middle poster there is no future without it. So the idea that there's 4 elements, and then you have to find that kind of magical 5th element that ties everything together. So my tagline for these 5 elements is there's no future without skills and no skills without hyper-engagement. So if you haven't seen the movie, please go check it out. It's a lot of fun. And at the end, I'm going to ask you a question. Which of these 5 that you see on the left-hand side is your 5th element? Which one kind of binds them all together and the one ring that rules them all? So let's start with personalization. Personalization is a very effective hyper-engagement strategy. It helps learners more effectively utilize their time and focus in on their competency gaps. This is a kind of a schematic of one type of personalization program. I'm going to give you a few examples here in a moment. But the general idea is you start here with a pre-assessment. The pre-assessment then identifies gaps. Those gaps are then tracked in some sort of personalized learning plan where each competency is either identified as a gap or tested out of sorts. Then the personalized learning plan path would then, deliver mosaics full of resources. So these resources could be PDFs or videos, experiential labs, and then ultimately some sort of assessment at the competency level. If the program has spaced repetition, then you continue here to the right-hand side where you're recharging your learning kind of at a competency level and badging up. So that's another kind of element we're going to talk about towards the end. Most personalized learning programs also have some sort of post-assessment that validates the competency skills, because again, just taking a pre-assessment and testing out of a competency doesn't necessarily validate that skill. So if during the post-assessment you fail a particular competency, then you can cycle back into the personalized learning path. So this is I know that was a lot at once, kind of a fire hose, but kind of a typical schematic or framework for a personalized learning plan. Some examples, we're working with a company called Cognizant that has rolled out a program called Cobalt, which is a kind of cybersecurity cinematic learning program. It's one of the best implementations of hyper engagement I've ever seen because it has all 10 elements. In this case, excuse me, they call brain scans, they call personalized pre-assessments brain scans. And these brain scans help identify a readiness profile, you can see here in the middle of the screen, at the competency level. Once the learner has identified, or the system has identified for the learner what their skills gaps are, they get mission resources kind of in an individualized and curated fashion. And this is done in real time and dynamically. As we'll see in a moment, you can also use machine learning and analytics to come back and inform that real-time curation so that the content is constantly being updated, and you build better correlations between specific resources and learner performance. And we'll talk about that closed loop in a moment. Another example is kind of a generic platform that Toolwire's created called Tile, where each competency is identified as a hexagonal icon or a tile. And those tiles are grouped into mosaics. Here we have a Java programming course that has 3 mosaics in it, and it starts with a personalized quiz. Once the learner goes through the personalized quiz, he or she receives a competency results matrix. And in the competency results matrix, it identifies the strong competencies and the weak competencies. The weak competencies then are the gaps, whereas the strong competencies are those that the learner, those tiles that the learner would test out of. So as you can see in the return to the mosaic screen, once the personalized pre-assessment has been completed, 6 out of the 15 tiles in effect have been tested out. And now the learner can focus in on the resources that are aligned or curated for their gaps, the competency gaps. So this is, again, a way of personalizing the content, individualizing the learning resources, and saving learners time. Another example of personalization, and this is a kind of a customization of the Tile platform, is a concept called fast forward. Fast forward doesn't necessarily check mark or test out like the previous example where you get the gold check mark. In the fast forward, it says, hey, congratulations, you are competent, at least according to a few pre-assessment test questions, you're competent in these particular tiles, but you haven't completed those tiles until you've passed a post-assessment, which is more rigorous. So this is for enterprises where they want more rigorous validation or verification of specific competencies. And so they're asking the learner, they're effectively telling the learner, you're fast forwarding through the resources, but you're not going to complete the tile and get the check mark until you pass another exam that's more rigorous. So this is a I think, a more, over time, potentially more effective way of validating skills. So here's an example of an analytic screen. I talked a little bit about, how personalization can get smarter over time. A lot of these platforms have machine learning and analytics in the back end that can build correlations between the resource usage and the learner performance. So resources that have a high positive correlation to passing assessments or assessment results can then get a higher weighted average in the personalized learning path, so that during real-time curation, they're favored in delivery to the student than others. In fact, you might, on a periodic basis, go in and remove resources that have a negative correlation to performance, thereby creating a more effective system. And the more and more students, a lot of these programs that we're talking about are delivered to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students. As you get millions of records of data, you can imagine how granular and how intelligent this data can get. So as we go, I'm going to be making, kind of recommendations or just kind of highlighting other vendors and platforms that deliver hyper engagement kind of at the element level. So from a personalization perspective, McGraw-Hill does a very good job of combining brain science and adaptive learning into, their adaptive curriculum, their learning science platforms. Acrobatique and Newton's been doing this a very long time. Also have, great adaptive platforms for creating smart learning paths, and also authoring tools for building adaptive and personalized learning into existing curricula. These are just a few examples. There's many others that are implementing personalization in their programs. Okay, next element, gamification. Gamification, again, is a word that means many things to many different people. That I see gamification as a spectrum. I think it, it can get a little bit crazy when you get into immersive reality, augmented or virtual reality. And it can be as simple as rewards, points, badges, that kind of thing. So what I wanted to do is show a few examples and lay out the spectrum of gamification, because some require obviously a much bigger investment, but could provide a much better result as well. The other thing to consider is the concept of gaming as it applies to learning has been around for a while. I know it happens kind of at the primary school level, in greater volume. But I think a lot of people are, while they're turned off by the term game, they are using gamification techniques in their learning programs without even knowing it. So in this example, points and badges, the structural gamify, where you add points and badges and rewards to your systems. Simulations, game-based learning and scenario-based learning, where you're creating more serious gaming. That's game-based learning, which is a little bit different than gamification, which is the process of using points and badges for motivation. And then ultimately, on the far right end of the spectrum, suspended reality. That Cobalt system that I showed you earlier uses immersive story-based gamification. It doesn't use virtual reality yet, but that's a whole nother webinar. So let's look at some examples. Here's some examples of a typical leaderboard. This would be points, badges. There's a badging system. This helps elicit motivation, competition, collaboration. There's a social element to gamification that's important. And in the Cobalt case, and some other cases I've seen, they're most effective when you tie the performance, the points performance, to tangible rewards. You can go to a reward center and get a corporate t-shirt or a movie tickets or something like that. And also, you maybe have departmental competitions, things of that nature, and then tie badges to career development. That's a whole nother element. You can see that's an element number 1 of the 10 elements of hyper engagement. Career development, anytime you tie learning performance to a person's earning potential or their career advancement, you're going to get much, much better engagement. Here's some examples of simulation games. These are business simulation games from Toolwire that help provide not only experiential scenario-based learning, but also experiential assessment. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But these are more game-based learning than they are gamification. You drop the student into a first-person scenario where they have to take on the role of a business professional and exhibit different elements of communication skills, managerial skills, leadership, etc. And during the 20 to 30 minute experience, all web-based and delivered, cinematically with actors, during that experience, they're assessed and they earn points and they get feedback, and there's analytics on the back end that's tracking a lot of their performance. As we talked about before, there's a number of folks out there doing some interesting things in gamification. I think Hoopla is one that comes to mind as far as motivating salespeople using a lot of gamification techniques. Muzzy Lane has built a authoring tool that allows people to build some game-based learning or simulation capabilities into their existing curriculum. And Badgeville, it's right there in the name, badges. It's a good badging system. And then Exonify is more of a game-based learning content repository and delivery system. So each of these companies, I think, is doing interesting things in gamification and could really, help create better engagement for your programs. Okay, so now as we move on to experiential learning, hands-on practice, I want to take a moment to get all cognitive with you for a second and take you back to Instructional Design 101 and the cognitive learning loop, because I think the concept of experiential and application and cognitive encoding is overlooked a little bit too much in today's kind of busy self-curation informal learning world. So this, I promise you this will only take 30 or 40 seconds and it won't be too painful. So there's 4 different types of, or 4 different phases, I guess, in the learning loop, the learning cycle. First is you learn, right? So that's where short-term memory, you watch videos or do some e-learning. And then there's a social element of that. And so whether it's a classroom or whether you're collaborating with other students, mentoring, nudging, there's some sort of element where you take what you learned and apply it in some sort of discussion. But you're not actually applying it kinesthetically until you get to the experiential element. And this is where I think the magic happens. The cognitive encoding from short-term to long-term memory happens through things like simulations, scenarios, hands-on labs. And then ultimately the feedback mechanism helps you assess whether or not learning occurred. And then once that content is in long-term memory, you can go through a cognitive reboot and start the cycle over for the next competency. So keeping this in mind, when you tackle hands-on practice and experiential assessment, you need to think about it from a hard skills and a soft skills perspective, because they each approach application or experiential learning in a different way. Starting with IT skills or technical skills, according to CIO Magazine, these are the high-demand 21st century skills. Cybersecurity is not a surprise. Full stack, that's kind of the hot new development standard. Networking, cloud engineers. So it's pretty easy to deliver hands-on practice from a technology perspective because there's lots of good technology to give remote access to these environments, and we'll look at that in just a moment. On the soft skills side, the World Economic Forum has identified these kind of top professional skills: problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, emotional intelligence, of course, is a very important one, cognitive flexibility. And I think what you're seeing here are the primary skills that I think are going to separate us over the next 20 years, us being human beings, from a lot of the robotic, machine learning, AI kind of apps and hardware that's coming out to replace jobs. And so I think the rapid reskilling in these types of these areas are going to become more and more important. And they're hard to assess experientially, and they're hard to deliver in a realistic way on the web. And so I'll talk about some of the simulations and scenarios that are being delivered to both teach and assess these skills. So from a hands-on kind of hard skills perspective, here's an example from that Cobalt program we talked about earlier, where a learner will come into a lab and they'll be given a mission quest, is what it's called in the cybersecurity story. And it's primarily around SQL or programming, Java or full stack development, some of those cybersecurity, some of those hot IT skills we saw earlier. And they'll come into the lab and they'll have access to a live environment for as long as they need, and they'll be given a quest. And the quest is a scenario where they'll have to help stop the bad guys from taking over the World Bank by building a program that blocks them, etc. It's fun, it's engaging, and most importantly, it's real world. And so, if I'm a full stack developer, I want to get my hands dirty. I want the keys to the car, and that quantum leap in engagement occurs when you give a learner access to the live environment. From other examples, this is a soft skill kind of example, a simulation. A lot of these business-oriented simulations, you have to run a company or a town, and you have, different decision-making criteria. Those decisions earn you, negative and positive points. And again, on the back end, we're constantly capturing analytics that give the administrators and the learners themselves and the instructors a lot of valuable data about how the student is demonstrating the skills, professional and soft skills they've learned previously. Next in the 5 elements, the 5 core elements of hyperengagement is experiential assessment. Now, experiential learning or hands-on practice is really only the first half of the story. Giving people access to the live environment or a simulated environment for them to apply and demonstrate their skills is one thing, but they need to be assessed. They need feedback on how well they did in that environment. A lot of times, learning professionals will make mistakes in building curriculum where they deliver experiential learning and then they assess the experiential learning with a bunch of quiz questions, and that's disjointed. So in the mission quest example for Cobalt, the student will come in, they'll build their program to help stop the bad guys from taking over the world banks, and then they'll be asked to paste that program into the quest validator, and the quest validator will automatically score the applicability of that code to solving the requirements within the problem. So if you look on the right-hand side of this example, there's 4 different requirements plus code output that the learner is measured against, and they get points for each of those. And so soft skills, I think, are also maybe even a little bit easier to experiential assess in soft skills because you can track and score decisions that are made through branching dialogue. In this particular case, this is a simulation on presentation skills, and so Edgar here gives a sample presentation, and then you will grade him, and then based on how effectively you matched the things he did right and wrong, you're going to be scored on that. So the decisions that someone makes in a simulation, or the way that they give feedback to fictitious characters, can all be scored, and that's a very effective way of experientially assessing soft skills. Okay, and then finally, spaced repetition or recharging. We all love the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This has been around for a long time, 100 years or so. And the idea is people forget very quickly, skills decay, and the best way to overcome the decay of competency or skills over time is to re-engage with the learning content on a periodic or spaced basis. The problem is it's really hard to get learners to re-engage with content. Getting them to engage is, the first time is hard enough. Getting them to re-engage is even harder. So some people have done some pretty creative things in this space, and I think it's a nascent area. There's only a few automated implementations of spaced repetition that I've seen. Here's one. This is an example from a spaced repetition or recharge schedule in the Tile platform. The idea is there's an algorithm, and the algorithm is the amount of decay of a person's skills, or in this case, the battery decay rate, is based on how well the learner mastered the competency initially. So if someone does really well at 90%, then they really know their stuff, and their skills are going to decay at a slower rate than someone who didn't do really well. Maybe they, 60%, they probably need to be recharged a little bit faster. And so this algorithm allows the learner to step up as they are recharged from SRS, spaced repetition schedule 1, 2 to 3. And then ultimately, there's a great Chinese proverb that says you never really know anything until you forget it 3 times. So neuroscience has proven that after you learn something 3 times, you basically have mastered it. So you don't have to do this kind of recharging forever. Here's an example of it in the Tile interface. So a recharge battery appears on a tile that has triggered the spaced repetition schedule. And when you go into the learning resources for a particular tile that needs to be recharged, you'll see the battery icons on the specific learning resources and on the quiz. Now, the really key thing about the implementation of this program is that you're not asking the learner to engage with the same resources again. You're delivering new resources. And those resources can be scaffolded and leveled up from a rigor perspective. And then the learner can earn badges, again, at a leveled perspective. So for example, if a novice, once a learner goes through the resources the first time, you can see all the check marks. Those are the first resources. Then 10 days, 20 days have passed, and it's time for the learner to re-engage with that content. They're going to re-engage with new content. And once they level up or pass that recharged content, they will earn an intermediate badge. And you can go to advanced badge or master badge. And so over time, the learner is being, the learner's motivated, and they're being rewarded for for going through the content and recharging over time. Here's an example of that badging strategy. So the first tile completion, you're a novice, then you become an intermediate, then advanced, and then a master. And once you're a master of a competency, that master badge can be put on your LinkedIn profile or added to your career development profile, and you don't have to recharge anymore. In addition to recharging, the program can help learners interact with content that has changed. So recharges can not only be used for content that is decayed or learning that's decayed, but also for skills that have changed because they're changing so rapidly. Here's another example of a company that's done this very well. This is Duolingo. For those of you who've used this, this mobile phone app to learn another language, you pick a language, you go through and learn particular words or conversations in different categories, and then over time, your language decays. I mean, obviously, we've all taken some language in high school or college, and now if we don't use it, we forget it. So language learning is a perfect example of spaced repetition, and Duolingo has done a great job using strength bars instead of a battery decay. Okay, so that's our 30 minutes. I always love to end with some tweetable moments, and I think I would encourage you to tweet these out or add some of your own. There is no future without skills, and no skills without hyper engagement. We learned that from the fifth element slide earlier. Second is kind of a new concept for today, but one that I'd like to throw out there and have you all respond to. Our capacity for rapid reskilling, aka learning, will keep us ahead in the job race with machines. And when I say machines, self-driving cars, AI apps, robots. There's lots of examples in the workplace of the future where millions and millions of jobs are displaced, which I think is fine, and that's progress, but we need to do a better job of reskilling rapidly the folks that are displaced so that they can continue to make a good living. And then finally, which is your fifth element of hyperengagement? Is it personalization, gamification, experiential, or spaced repetition? I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. And with that, we'll call it a webinar and open it up to questions.